Hi everybody, it's Brian and we're back with our first Fusion 360 tutorial. This is some basic geometry and I know it's pretty simple, but I think this is the best way to get us started. So I'm throwing up a PDF view of a typical mechanical drawing of an object. Here we have a top, front, and side view, as well as an isometric view of, again, a very simple geometry. We're going to go ahead and draw this for you in the video, and I would encourage you to follow along inside Fusion. We'll be using this very simple geometry to explore kind of the approach to drawing in Fusion 360, as well as some other basic Fusion 360 interface options as far as like zooming in and rotating, dimensioning, and that sort of thing. Looking at this drawing quickly before we move in and start to actually draw it, one thing to note is that all of the dimensions here, except for one, is on this front view, and so that should be a pretty good indication that this will be based off of a sketch on the front plane. We're going to take that sketch and extrude it out, and the only thing I really need to pull from that extrusion is this dimension here on the side of 25 millimeters. So we're going to draw this face and we're going to extrude it out of the screen surface 25 millimeters to create this very simple geometry. So we need to move to the Fusion 360 platform to actually go ahead and draw this, and that's what we're going to do next. Okay, so we'll go ahead and open up Fusion 360 and go ahead and begin drawing this this object here. So as you noticed when I looked over that 2D drawing, we talked about the front face being kind of the primary face, and so we're going to start our sketch using that front face. So as I mentioned in our the earlier video on the Fusion 360 interface, we kind of work from left to right, and we're going to start by creating a sketch. So the very first icon here at the top is the Create Sketch icon. I go ahead and click on that. Fusion 360 is going to ask me to select a plane on which to draw on, and you can see you can kind of hover through these planes. If you're not sure which plane is which, again, look at your view cube here, and it's sort of telling you the front orientation is this face, which is this plane here. I want to keep my object so that if I send this to somebody else and I say look at the front plane, I want them to understand that this is the front face, so therefore I don't want to draw it on the top face if it is in fact the front view. So I'm going to select the front plane, and you'll notice what happens when I do that. Fusion takes that plane and it makes it what's called normal to my monitor surface. So now my whole monitor surface only exists on that plane. I'm not seeing things in 3D anymore, I'm seeing them in 2D. And you see the origin point kind of as the defining factor here. In order to be fully defined, and I'll talk about that as we draw this, in order to be fully defined, something has to be referencing the geometry has to be referencing the origin point. In this case, it's a very simple geometry, so I'm actually going to just start by drawing at the origin point. But other things, maybe you want to make the origin point the center of it, or maybe you want it 10 millimeters off to the left. As long as you either dimension from the origin point or you're attached to the origin point somehow, that's all that really matters. So the sketch that we're going to do is going to be simple 5 lines. The goal in Fusion here is to make this sketch exactly that, a sketch. So we're not going to try to nail the geometry perfectly. We're just going to simply capture as closely as possible the geometry that exists, and then we're going to use constraints to further narrow down the specificity of that geometry. And so I think that will make sense as we move forward here. So now you'll notice that my Create menu, the icons here have changed a little bit. The first one here on the left is the line command, and that's where I'm going to start. So I'm going to click on line to invoke the line command. You'll see my cursor changes. It's showing me that I have a line command, and it gives me the little crosshair. And like I said, I'm going to start by clicking the origin point to place that first point. I'm going to pull out this line to the right, and when I do that, I want to make sure that I see the little icon that shows that this is a horizontal line. Now, if you're away from the horizontal like I am here, not a big deal. We can always go back and add that horizontal constraint, but it's easier and faster if we just draw to make sure that we include that horizontal icon. That's that light blue icon. The other thing that I'm not going to focus on too much, but I do want it to be at least in the appropriate numeric range, is the length of this line. So you can see underneath, it's highlighted blue. It says this line is 95.792. The drawing actually wants that line to be 100. As long as I'm close to that, I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to dial that in here. I'm going to add dimensions that will lock that in just a little bit. So, if I'm anywhere between probably 75 and 110 or so, 120, that's fine. I just don't want to make that like a 6mm line if it's going to be a 100mm line. So here I am, 98mm, that looks good. So I'm going to click to position that line. You'll see it locks in that horizontal icon, and then the line command is still active. So if I start to move my cursor away from that, it allows me to pull a line up, and it's giving me some feedback here on the length of that line. If I go back to my original drawing, I don't really know what the length of that was. I just know that it was a vertical line here, and that it was probably 90 degrees to that surface. So I'm going to make sure I see that light blue 90-degree icon there. Click. The top of this is slightly elevated, so I'm going to make sure that it's not at a 90 degree. I'm just going to make sure that it's at a slight angle here. Going up, click. I'm going to pull over, and I know again that this last line here, that this is the line that I'm drawing now is kind of a downward slope, and the last line that goes from the origin point up is 90 degrees to that horizontal that I first drew. And so what I want to do is, if you notice, what I did was I brought that cursor down to the origin point and then started to pull away, and you can see I'm getting that light blue tracking line. Now if I stop halfway up, it's kind of tracking over to the midpoint of the line on the right. I don't want it to be locked there, so I'm going to pull up a little bit away from that, and if I go up even further, you'll see it'll track over to that line on the other side. That would be great if my left and right verticals were identical in length. They are not, so I'm going to let that come down a little bit so I don't see that. All I want to see is that tracking line coming up from my origin point. Once I have that, I'm going to click, and then my last click is going to be right back at the origin point. You'll see, as long as you're close, you'll see that blue bounding box kind of snap there. As long as you can see that blue bounding box, if you click, it'll tie that line back to the beginning. The minute I click, you'll notice a couple things happened. I'm going to go ahead and hit the escape key on my keyboard. That's going to deselect the line command. And I can zoom in. I'm going to use my scroll wheel here to zoom in a little bit on this object, so we're looking at it a little bit more prominently on the screen. After I click that final line, you'll see that the inside of this becomes shaded. That means that all of the points are connected, and this is a complete solid object. Well, that's probably I shouldn't say solid object. That's a terminology I shouldn't use. It is a closed object, right? So the line completely closes. There's not a break between 2 points. If for some reason you click your last thing and you think it is a complete object, but it's not shaded inside, it probably means that you hit escape and started the line command. Maybe you didn't attach it to the points in the corners or something like that. Just look for somewhere where there's a break between 2 points that would allow, we would call this watertight. It would allow water from inside to flow out, or from water from out here to flow in. But we want to make sure that this is a complete sketch all the way here. The other thing you notice is right now there's some of the lines are blue and some of the lines are black. The black lines are lines that are have some level of definition, and the lines that are blue are kind of totally up for being modified. And what I mean by that is, if I go in with my cursor now and I click this point here to activate it, you'll see that it activates blue. And if I click and hold on it, I can drag that point around to kind of modify my geometry. right? If I look here, this point, if I click on that, that's also a blue point. The line is black, which means if I click on the line, I can't move that line up or down. If I click on that point, I can't move that point up or down, but I can move it left or right. So what that's indicating to me is I need to apply some level of dimension on this line in order to constrain where that point goes. In this case, this point here, I can't move it. I mean, I can move it left and right, and I can move that point up and down, but you'll notice that I can't change the angle of that line because it has this constraint of 90 degrees between the horizontal and that vertical, just like this line here has that same constraint at that point, right? So again, this line, if I click on that point, I can move it up and down, but I can't move it left and right because it also has what's called a coincident relationship with my origin point. So that line can't be anywhere but perpendicular to this line at this point, right? So this one has a little bit more freedom. This line down here has a little bit more freedom. This line up here has a lot of freedom. If I click and hold on that line, you can see I can change the size of that line. Similarly, I can do that with this one to a certain extent. Our goal is to make sure that everything is black, and we're going to do that by adding either additional constraints, and those constraints are things like horizontal and vertical, coincident, which I mentioned there's a coincident relationship between the beginning of this line and the origin point, tangent, equal, we can make two lines equal, we can make two lines parallel, we can make two lines perpendicular, right? That already exists here. We can fix a point, so we can say like this point, if I click fix, it's going to lock that point so that point can't move. I can make some relationship or constraint to a midpoint, so like the middle of this line. So you can see you have a bunch of options here. Collinear means those two lines fall on the same line. Symmetry means that I can denote an axis of symmetry and then make things symmetrical about that axis. And I can also constrain two more things to have an equal or smooth curvature about a point. So we have all of these different constraints here. We'll primarily be working with the ones on the left, but the other way to constrain geometry is through something called dimensions. And this is how we tell people exactly how long something is or what the angle between two things are. And so if you remember that initial sketch, almost all of our constraints, aside from the ones that we already have here, these perpendicular and the horizontal one, all of the rest of the constraints are really built around dimensions. So dimension for me, I'm going to use the dimension tool. I have this added to my tool menu. Most likely you will not see it here. You'll have to click where it says create, and then sketch dimension is all the way at the bottom. The other thing I want to point out here is some of these commands have a letter next to them. So you notice that under sketch dimension there's this letter D. Under line L, if I go into the circle command, the center diameter circle is a C. That is a shortcut. So rather than having to come all the way up here to invoke the line command, you can literally just type L and get that same line command. In this case, sketch dimension, I can either click the buttons, click down here, I can click the icon here, or I can type D. So I'm going to click sketch dimension. Whoops, it activated to that last line because I had it selected. I'm going to hit escape to deactivate that. I'm going to hit escape a couple times to make sure that no line is highlighted. Then I'm going to click sketch dimension. And now I'm going to click this bottom line. That's going to allow me to create a dimension of the length of that. So I click the line, I pull away from that to position my dimension. I can position where I want to see, left or right. I'm going to kind of keep this in the middle, and I click, and now I'm going to type 100 because it's supposed to be 100 millimeters long. All right. If you notice after I do that, you'll see that this edge sort of moved over a little bit left by 2 millimeters actually, because it was like 102 point something. It moved over by like 2 millimeters. You'll also notice that if you look at my cursor, the sketch dimension tool is still active, which means I can go in and dimension another entity here. So I'm going to come over here to the left, click on this line on the left. Again, pull away. So it's, if you hear I'm clicking and letting go, pull away, position my dimension where I want it, type in a value. This is going to be 35. Enter. I also have a dimension of this line. So I'm going to come up here to this line, click on it, and I want you to note something here. Looking at the first sketch, what I actually am given is the x distance of the line. So if I start to pull perpendicular from this line, it's actually giving me the distance of that line, right? If I move my cursor a little bit up, you'll notice how that dimension changes. This is called a smart dimensioning tool. So it's automatically modifying which dimension it gives me. This is the dimension I actually want. It's that x directional dimension. I don't want the length dimension, and I don't want, you'll see if I tilt my cursor a little bit down this way, it'll start to give me the y dimension here. I don't want the y dimension either. I want the x dimension. So make sure that that's the active one before you click to position. And this is going to be 44, and you'll watch how the geometry changes the minute I type this value in, right? Okay, so those are the length dimensions. Those are the length dimensions. The rest of my dimensions, I mean, I could start to constrain this by giving this a height here, this little line. I could give that a height. I could give this a length, right, either in the x or a length or in the y direction. But the last two dimensions that I need to fully define this geometry are angle measurements. Before I do the angle measurements, I want to point out a couple things. One, this line, this point is now a white point, which means this point no longer moves. It can't move, it's constrained. If I hover over this, this point can move, but in a limited direction. I can move up or down with that, but I can't move left or right because it's being constrained by this dimension here. This also can move in certain dimensions. So let's look at that. If I hit escape to get out of the dimension tool, click on this, look, I can move this up and down. I can't move it left or right. This point, if I click and hold, I can't move it left or right, but I can move it up or down. This point, I can't move up or down or left or right. That point is already fixed, right? This line has now turned black, but we still have two blue lines, and we need to turn those black to fully constrain this. So back to my dimension tool. Again, I mentioned it's a smart dimension tool. So watch what I'm going to do here. I'm going to first come over to the left edge, click on it, then come up to my right edge and click on it. You'll notice after I click that left edge, it's giving me that same dimension that I've already created here. Don't worry about it. You don't have to hit escape. It's not a mistake. Just go up to this other line and click on it, and you'll notice Fusion 360 automatically switches to that angle dimension between them. So I click to position that. This is 140 degrees, so I type in 140, hit enter. Whoa, that really changes my geometry. I'm going to zoom out a little bit here. And I'm just going to pan down so I can see what's going on. And I have one more dimension, the angle between these 2 points. So I'm going to click on this line, click on this line, move this, click to position it, and that is 125 degrees. When I do that, it finalizes that geometry, and the geometry is finalized, I know, by 2 things. One, all of the lines have turned black, and the other thing I know is if I hit escape here to get out of my dimension tool, I can't, if I grab any one of these points, if I click and hold, I can't move any of these lines, right? I'm clicking and holding, nothing happening, hit escape, clicking and holding, nothing is happening, hit escape, right? All of these lines are exactly the way they need to be. So that fully defines our sketch, right? It's those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dimensions, and these 1, 2, 3 constraints. If you lose any of these 3 constraints, if you lose any of those dimensions, it's not going to be fully defined, so we need all of those. All right, so that is it for the sketch. Very important, when you're done sketching, you have to hit this Finish Sketch button. So you come up here to the top right corner, you hit the green check mark, and that just tells Fusion, I'm done with that sketch. When you do that, it typically returns you to an orthographic projection, where we have this geometry here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take that 2D geometry, right, which is literally just a surface. It has 0 thickness in this y direction this way. It has 0 thickness. It only has a dimension on this XZ plane. Now what I want to do is I want to give this thing some dimension by extruding this geometry. So think about if you ever had Play-Doh when you were little, and you kind of jammed it into that device and you squeezed it and it like made a star pattern that it like squirted out a long star shape, right? That's called extrusion. We're using that very same principle here. The tool for extrusion, you'll notice that my create menu has changed back to these tools. The extrude button is the second one over. It's kind of a good default option. There are other tools here under the Create menu as well, but I'm going to just choose Extrude. When I choose Extrude, if I have multiple sketches that don't have areas, it might ask me to choose a surface to extrude. Because I only have this one sketch, Fusion defaults under Profile to selecting that one sketch. You'll see it pops up this blue arrow or this value indicator. You can grab that blue arrow and push it in or out, and you'll notice that you go from negative to positive, right? So you can choose which direction you want to go. And it's giving you a value here. That value also shows up here. I'm going to cover some of these things in just a minute, but to finish off this exercise, we're going to change the distance from 20. So I'm going to go in here and click, backspace. I'm going to make it 25 to finish this off, and click OK. And that finalizes my geometry, right? So if I orbit this thing around, you'll see that now we have 3D geometry that has all that sketch of that original profile, and now it has that dimension. So I'm going to stop here with this tutorial. The next video, just to break things up, I'm going to go back to the same object and just show you how to do some easy modifications inside Fusion to go back and modify dimensions, change extrusions, and just show you some of the things that you can do to change the geometry once you have an existing geometry. All right, thank you so much, and I'll see you on the next tutorial.